The religious landscape of early Rome emerged from a complex amalgamation of indigenous Italic traditions, Etruscan divine concepts, and Greek mythological frameworks that gradually coalesced during the city's formative centuries. This synthesis created a unique theological system that would eventually become one of history's most enduring mythological traditions, yet its origins remain deeply rooted in the practical religious needs of an emerging Mediterranean power. The earliest Roman religious consciousness centered around the concept of noumena, divine forces or spirits that inhabited specific locations, objects, or natural phenomena. These noumena differed fundamentally from the anthropomorphic deities that would later dominate Roman mythology. They represented raw divine power without human characteristics, embodying the spiritual essence of springs, groves, crossroads, and household spaces. The noumen of a place demanded respect and propitiation through specific rituals, creating a religious framework that emphasized practical reciprocity between humans and divine forces rather than elaborate mythological narratives. Archaeological evidence from the Palatine Hill and surrounding areas reveals that these indigenous religious practices included the worship of Terminus, the boundary stone deity, and the Penates, household gods who protected the family's provisions and well-being. The Lairs, originally agricultural deities associated with cultivated fields, evolved into protective spirits of the home and crossroads. These early divine concepts reflected the agrarian concerns of Rome's founding communities, where successful harvests and protected boundaries meant survival. The Etruscan influence on early Roman religious development cannot be overstated. The Etruscans, who dominated central Italy from the 8th to the 6th centuries BCE, possessed a sophisticated religious system that included elaborate divination practices, structured priesthoods, and complex relationships with anthropomorphic deities. Their haruspices, priests who interpreted the will of the gods through examination of sacrificial animals' entrails, introduced Romans to formalized divine communication methods that would become central to Roman state religion. Etruscan deities began appearing in Roman religious contexts during the 7th century BCE, often merged with existing noumena or introduced as new divine entities. Minerva, the Etruscan goddess of wisdom and crafts, found her way into Roman worship through this cultural exchange. The Etruscan Uni, a powerful goddess associated with fertility and protection, influenced the development of Juno's cult in Rome. Most significantly, the Etruscan Tinia, their supreme sky god, provided characteristics that would later merge with Jupiter's divine persona. The Etruscan practice of templum, the ritual division of space for religious purposes, fundamentally shaped Roman sacred architecture and urban planning. Etruscan priests taught Romans to read divine will through the flight patterns of birds within designated sky quadrants, a practice called augury that became essential to Roman decision-making processes. The Etruscan concept of the mundus, a ritual pit connecting the world of the living with the underworld, influenced Roman understanding of the relationship between earthly and divine realms. Greek colonization of southern Italy, beginning in the 8th century BCE, introduced Romans to fully developed mythological narratives featuring anthropomorphic deities with complex personalities, relationships, and stories. The Greek colonies of Magna Graecia, including Cumae, Neapolis, Tarentum, and Syracuse, served as cultural transmission points where Greek religious concepts encountered Roman and Italic traditions. Unlike the abstract noumena or the ritualistic Etruscan deities, Greek gods possessed human-like emotions, engaged in dramatic conflicts, and participated in elaborate mythological cycles. The Greek Apollo arrived in Roman religious consciousness through the Cumaean Sibyl, a prophetic priestess whose oracles became central to Roman religious decision-making. The Sibylline books, a collection of prophetic verses allegedly purchased from the Cumaean Sibyl by the Roman king Tarquin the Proud, represented one of the earliest formal adoptions of Greek religious elements into Roman practice. These books were consulted during times of crisis and often recommended the introduction of new Greek deities or religious practices to address specific problems. Greek Hermes transformed into the Roman Mercurius, initially maintaining his role as a messenger deity but gradually acquiring additional functions related to commerce and trade, concerns particularly relevant to Rome's growing mercantile activities. The Greek Artemis became Diana, retaining her association with hunting and the moon, while acquiring additional characteristics related to the protection of slaves and the lower classes. Aphrodite's transformation into Venus initially emphasized her role as a goddess of vegetation and gardens, before her later association with love and beauty became prominent. The process of religious syncretism during this period involved careful adaptation rather than wholesale adoption. Roman religious authorities, particularly the pontiffs who oversaw sacred law and ritual, ensured that foreign religious elements were integrated in ways that supported Roman social and political structures. Greek mythological narratives were modified to emphasize Roman values such as duty, discipline, and service to the state rather than the individual heroism and personal glory that characterized many Greek myths. The establishment of the Capitoline Triad, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, during the 6th century BCE exemplified this syncretic process. Jupiter combined elements of the indigenous sky god with Greek Zeus and Etruscan Tinia, creating a supreme deity who embodied Roman concepts of authority and justice. Juno merged the protective aspects of various Italic goddesses with Greek Hera's role as divine queen, while Minerva brought together Etruscan wisdom traditions with Greek Athena's martial and intellectual attributes. Temple construction during this period reflected the integration of these diverse religious influences. The Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, begun during the reign of Tarquin the Proud and completed in the early Republic, combined Etruscan architectural techniques with Greek sculptural decoration and Roman political symbolism. The temple's 3 chambers housed the Capitoline Triad, while its elevated position overlooking the Forum Romanum emphasized the connection between divine authority and political power. Religious festivals during this formative period demonstrate the practical integration of diverse mythological traditions. The Robigelia, celebrated in April to protect crops from disease, maintained its indigenous character while incorporating Greek-style processions and sacrifices. The Lemuria, a festival for appeasing restless spirits of the dead, combined ancient Roman ancestor worship with Etruscan underworld concepts and Greek heroic traditions. The role of women in early Roman religious practice reflected the influence of all 3 cultural traditions. Indigenous Italic traditions included powerful female deities associated with fertility and protection, while Etruscan religious practices granted significant authority to female priests and diviners. Greek mythological narratives provided models for complex goddess figures who wielded considerable divine power. The resulting Roman religious system included influential priestesses such as the Vestal Virgins, who maintained the sacred flame of Vesta, and the Flaminica Dielis, the wife of Jupiter's high priest, who possessed significant ritual authority. The development of Roman religious law during this period established the framework for managing this complex mythological synthesis. The Ius Divinum, divine law, regulated the proper performance of religious rituals and the maintenance of relationships with the gods. The pontiffs developed elaborate procedures for introducing new deities, establishing festivals, and interpreting divine will through various forms of divination. These legal structures ensured that religious innovation occurred within controlled parameters that supported Roman political and social stability. Trade relationships during the 7th and 6th centuries BCE facilitated the continued exchange of religious ideas and practices. Roman merchants encountered Greek deities in their original context throughout the Mediterranean, while Etruscan religious specialists continued to serve Roman communities as diviners and ritual experts. This ongoing cultural exchange meant that Roman mythology remained dynamic and responsive to new influences while maintaining its distinctive character. The emergence of Roman historical consciousness during this period began to create mythological narratives that explain the city's origins and divine favour. The story of Romulus and Remus, while containing obvious mythological elements, served to establish Rome's special relationship with the gods and justify its growing political dominance in central Italy. These foundation myths incorporated elements from all three cultural traditions: indigenous Italic wolf symbolism, Etruscan divination practices, and Greek heroic narratives, creating uniquely Roman mythological content. The establishment of the Roman Republic in 509 BCE marked a fundamental transformation in how divine authority intersected with political power, creating an unprecedented system where mythological narratives served explicit state functions while maintaining their spiritual significance. The expulsion of the last Etruscan king, Tarquin the Proud, necessitated a complete restructuring of religious authority that had previously been concentrated in royal hands. This transition created opportunities for the systematic codification of Roman deities and their mythological frameworks, establishing the canonical relationships between Roman gods and their Greek counterparts that would define Mediterranean religious thought for centuries. The process of divine codification began with the formal recognition of Jupiter as the supreme deity of the Roman state. But this recognition required careful theological work to distinguish the Roman Jupiter from both his Greek counterpart Zeus and his Etruscan predecessor Tinia. Roman religious authorities, working through the newly established College of Pontiffs, developed mythological narratives that emphasized Jupiter's role as guarantor of oaths, protector of the state, and divine source of legitimate authority. Unlike the Greek Zeus, whose mythological cycles often depicted him as capricious and driven by personal desires, the Roman Jupiter embodied gravitas and institutional stability. His temple on the Capitoline Hill became the focal point for state ceremonies, where consuls offered sacrifices before departing for military campaigns, and where triumphing generals acknowledged divine favour for their victories. The codification process extended systematically through the major deities of the Roman pantheon. Mars underwent perhaps the most significant transformation during this period, evolving from a primarily agricultural deity associated with spring growth and fertility into the divine patron of Roman military virtue. While maintaining his identification with the Greek Ares, Mars acquired distinctly Roman characteristics that emphasized disciplined warfare over the chaotic battle fury associated with his Greek counterpart. Roman mythological narratives presented Mars as the divine father of Romulus, creating a direct genealogical connection between the god of war and the city's foundation. This mythological framework provided religious justification for Roman military expansion, while establishing Mars as a deity concerned with the protection and advancement of Roman interests specifically. Venus represented another crucial example of how Greek deities were adapted to serve Roman ideological needs. Initially associated with vegetation and gardens, Venus gradually acquired the attributes of Aphrodite while developing unique Roman characteristics that emphasized her role as divine ancestor of the Roman people through her son Aeneas. The mythological narrative of Aeneas's journey from Troy to Italy, which became central to Roman identity during the Republican period, positioned Venus as both a goddess of love and beauty and a divine protector of Roman destiny. This dual nature allowed Venus to serve multiple functions within Roman religious practice, from personal devotion related to love and marriage to state ceremonies acknowledging divine favour for Roman expansion. The development of distinctly Roman mythological themes during the Republican period reflected the political and social values that distinguished Roman culture from its Greek and Etruscan predecessors. The concept of pietas, duty to gods, family and state, became central to Roman mythological narratives in ways that fundamentally altered the character of stories borrowed from Greek sources. Roman versions of mythological tales consistently emphasized the consequences of fulfilling or abandoning one's duties, rather than celebrating individual achievement or personal glory. The story of Aeneas exemplified this transformation, presenting a hero whose greatness derived from his unwavering commitment to his divine mission and his people's welfare rather than from personal prowess or cleverness. Honour, defined in Roman terms as the recognition earned through service to the community and adherence to traditional values, became another dominant theme in Republican mythological development. Roman religious narratives consistently portrayed divine favour as the reward for honourable conduct, while divine punishment inevitably followed dishonourable behaviour. This moral framework provided religious sanction for Roman social hierarchies and political institutions, suggesting that the gods themselves endorsed the values that maintained Roman society. The mythological emphasis on honour also supported Roman military culture, where individual reputation depended on service to the state and adherence to military discipline. Civic virtue, the third pillar of Roman mythological themes, represented the synthesis of personal excellence and public service that Romans considered the highest human achievement. Unlike Greek heroic ideals that often celebrated individual accomplishment regardless of social consequences, Roman mythological narratives consistently presented civic virtue as the source of both personal fulfillment and divine approval. The stories of early Roman heroes like Cincinnatus, who left his plough to serve as dictator before returning to his farm, became mythological exemplars that demonstrated how individual excellence should serve collective welfare. The institutional framework for managing this mythological development centered on the Pontifex Maximus and the College of Priests, religious offices that acquired unprecedented authority during the early Republic. The Pontifex Maximus, elected from among the patrician class, served as the chief interpreter of divine will and the ultimate authority on religious law. This position combined practical administrative responsibilities with theological authority, allowing the Pontifex Maximus to shape mythological interpretations in ways that supported Roman political and social objectives. The College of Pontiffs, working under the Pontifex Maximus's direction, developed detailed procedures for conducting religious ceremonies, interpreting divine signs, and integrating new religious elements into Roman practice. The standardization of religious practices during this period required extensive documentation and codification of mythological knowledge. The pontiffs maintained detailed records of religious ceremonies, divine signs, and mythological interpretations that provided precedents for future religious decisions. These records, known as the Commentarii Pontificum, became the authoritative source for Roman religious law and mythological interpretation. The pontiffs also supervised the Sibylline books, consulting these prophetic texts during times of crisis and using their recommendations to introduce new religious practices or deities when circumstances required divine intervention. The integration of foreign deities through evocatio represented one of the most distinctive features of Roman religious practice during the Republican period. This ritual process allowed Romans to invite foreign gods to abandon their previous homes and accept worship in Rome, effectively expanding the Roman pantheon through religious conquest. The evocatio ceremony typically occurred during military campaigns, where Roman commanders would offer superior worship and more magnificent temples to enemy deities in exchange for their support. This practice reflected the Roman understanding that divine favour could be transferred through proper ritual procedures, making religious conquest a complement to military victory. The Evostio of Juno Regina from the Etruscan city of Veii in 396 BCE established the precedent for this practice and demonstrated its effectiveness as a tool of Roman expansion. The Roman commander Marcus Furius Camillus formally invited Juno Regina to abandon Veii and accept worship in Rome, promising her a magnificent temple on the Aventine Hill. Following the successful capture of Veii, the Romans attributed their victory to Juno Regina's divine assistance and fulfilled their promise by constructing an elaborate temple dedicated to her worship. This successful evocatio encouraged the Romans to employ similar tactics throughout their subsequent military campaigns. The expansion of the Roman pantheon during territorial conquests involved careful theological work to integrate new deities without disrupting existing religious structures. Foreign gods were typically identified with existing Roman deities when possible, creating syncretic combinations that preserved the essential characteristics of both traditions. When direct identification proved impossible, foreign deities were incorporated as distinct entities with specific spheres of influence that complemented rather than competed with established Roman gods. This process required extensive consultation with religious authorities and often involved the construction of new temples or the modification of existing religious festivals to accommodate additional divine presences. The cult of Cybele, the great mother goddess from Anatolia, exemplified the complexities involved in integrating foreign deities during the Republican period. The Sibylline books recommended importing Cybele's cult during the crisis of the Second Punic War, suggesting that her worship would provide divine assistance against Hannibal's invasion. The Romans sent a delegation to Pessinus in Anatolia to obtain the sacred stone that represented Cybele's divine presence, transporting it to Rome with elaborate ceremonies that demonstrated the state's commitment to her worship. However, the integration of Cybele's cult required significant modifications to accommodate Roman sensibilities, particularly regarding the ecstatic rituals and self-castration practices associated with her priests. The development of Roman religious festivals during the Republican period reflected the ongoing process of mythological integration and standardization. Existing festivals were expanded and systematized to accommodate new deities and mythological narratives, while entirely new celebrations were created to honor recently imported gods or commemorate significant religious events. The Ludi Romani, originally a simple harvest festival, evolved into an elaborate celebration that included theatrical performances of mythological narratives, chariot races dedicated to various deities, and public sacrifices that reinforced the connection between divine favor and Roman prosperity. The introduction of Greek theatrical traditions during the 3rd century BCE provided new venues for presenting mythological narratives to Roman audiences. Greek tragedies and comedies, adapted to emphasize Roman values and religious themes, became popular entertainment that also served educational functions by familiarizing ordinary Romans with the stories and characteristics of their gods. These theatrical presentations required careful adaptation to ensure that Greek mythological content supported rather than undermined Roman religious and social values, leading to the development of distinctly Roman dramatic traditions that combined Greek narrative techniques with Roman moral frameworks. The role of divination in Republican religious practice expanded significantly during this period, with various forms of divine communication becoming central to political decision-making. The College of Augurs, responsible for interpreting the flight patterns of birds and other natural omens, developed elaborate procedures for reading divine will that influenced everything from military campaigns to legislative proposals. The haruspices, originally Etruscan specialists in reading sacrificial entrails, were formally incorporated into Roman religious practice and consulted regularly on matters of state importance. These divination practices required extensive mythological knowledge, as interpreters needed to understand the relationships between various deities and their methods of communication with mortals. The expansion of Roman territory during the Republican period brought Romans into contact with increasingly diverse religious traditions, each requiring careful evaluation and potential integration into Roman practice. The conquest of Greece during the 2nd century BCE presented particular challenges as Romans encountered Greek religious practices in their original contexts and had to reconcile their adapted versions of Greek deities with authentic Greek traditions. This contact led to increased sophistication in Roman mythological understanding and the development of more nuanced theological frameworks that could accommodate multiple versions of divine narratives without creating contradictions. The influence of Hellenistic religious and philosophical traditions during the later Republican period introduced new complexity to Roman mythological thought. Stoic philosophy, with its emphasis on divine providence and cosmic order, provided intellectual frameworks that supported Roman religious practices while offering sophisticated theological explanations for divine behavior. Epicurean philosophy, despite its skeptical approach to traditional religion, influenced Roman thinking about the nature of divine intervention and the relationship between human behavior and divine favor. These philosophical influences encouraged more systematic approaches to mythological interpretation and the development of theological frameworks that could withstand intellectual scrutiny. The transformation of Rome from republic to empire under Augustus fundamentally altered the relationship between mythology and political power, creating an unprecedented fusion of historical narrative and divine legitimacy that would define imperial ideology for centuries. Augustus's rise to power required not merely military victory, but a complete reimagining of Roman religious and mythological frameworks to accommodate the radical concept of permanent, divinely sanctioned autocracy. This process began with Augustus's careful cultivation of his relationship with Apollo, a deity whose associations with prophecy, order, and civilized governance provided the perfect divine patron for a ruler who presented himself as the restorer of peace and traditional values. The selection of Apollo as Augustus's patron deity represented a calculated theological decision that distinguished the new imperial mythology from the chaotic civil wars that had preceded it. Unlike Mars, whose associations with warfare might have reminded Romans of the destructive conflicts of the late Republic, Apollo embodied the cultural and intellectual achievements that Augustus sought to promote. The emperor's construction of a magnificent temple to Apollo on the Palatine Hill, directly connected to his own residence, created a physical manifestation of his special relationship with the god. This temple housed the Sibylline books, transferring these ancient prophetic texts from their traditional location in the Temple of Jupiter to a space directly controlled by the emperor, symbolically placing divine prophecy under imperial authority. The mythological framework surrounding Augustus's divine connections extended far beyond his relationship with Apollo through the systematic development of his genealogical claims to divine ancestry. The Julian family's purported descent from Venus through Aeneas provided Augustus with a mythological pedigree that connected him directly to the gods while emphasizing his role as the fulfillment of Rome's divine destiny. This genealogical mythology required careful elaboration and documentation, leading to the commission of extensive literary works that would establish these divine connections as accepted historical fact rather than mere political propaganda. Virgil's Aeneid, completed during the early years of Augustus's reign, represented the most sophisticated and influential attempt to create a comprehensive mythological framework for imperial legitimacy. The epic's narrative structure deliberately paralleled Augustus's own rise to power, presenting Aeneas as a divinely chosen leader who overcame tremendous obstacles to establish the foundations of Roman greatness. The poem's emphasis on pietas, fate, and divine providence created a theological framework that justified imperial rule as the natural culmination of divine will working through history. Virgil's portrayal of Aeneas as a reluctant hero who accepted his divine mission despite personal cost provided a mythological template for Augustus's own presentation of himself as a leader who had accepted the burden of rule for the greater good of Rome. The political symbolism embedded within the Aeneid extended beyond simple genealogical claims to encompass a complete reinterpretation of Roman history and destiny. Virgil's description of Aeneas's shield, crafted by Vulcan and depicting scenes from future Roman history, culminating in Augustus's victory at Actium, created a mythological narrative that presented the emperor's triumph as the inevitable fulfillment of divine providence. The poem's portrayal of the underworld, where Aeneas encounters the souls of future Roman heroes, established a mythological framework that connected imperial rule to the accumulated virtue and sacrifice of all previous generations of Romans. The development of emperor worship during Augustus's reign required careful navigation of Roman religious sensibilities, which had traditionally distinguished between mortal humans and divine beings. Augustus's solution involved the establishment of the imperial cult, a religious framework that honoured the emperor's genius or divine spirit without explicitly claiming full divinity for his mortal person. This theological distinction allowed Romans to participate in emperor worship without completely abandoning their traditional religious categories, while still providing the religious foundation necessary for imperial legitimacy. The cult of Augustus's genius spread throughout the empire, with temples and altars dedicated to his divine spirit appearing in cities across the Mediterranean world. The process of deification that transformed historical figures into mythological beings began with Julius Caesar's posthumous consecration as Divus Julius, establishing the precedent for imperial apotheosis that would become a central feature of Roman imperial mythology. The appearance of a comet during the games celebrating Caesar's deification provided convenient divine confirmation of his transformation into a god, while Augustus's role as the son of a deified ruler enhanced his own claims to divine favour. This deification process required elaborate religious ceremonies and the construction of temples dedicated to the worship of deceased emperors, creating a pantheon of imperial gods that paralleled the traditional Roman deities. The expansion of imperial mythology under Augustus's successors in the Julio-Claudian dynasty involved increasingly elaborate claims to divine ancestry and favour. Tiberius, despite his personal reluctance to embrace imperial cult practices, maintained the religious framework established by Augustus while adding his own contributions to imperial mythology through his patronage of religious festivals and temple construction. Caligula's brief reign witnessed the most extreme development of imperial divine claims, with the emperor demanding worship as a living god and constructing temples dedicated to his own divinity. This excess prompted a reaction under Claudius, who restored more moderate approaches to imperial divinity while continuing to develop the mythological frameworks that supported imperial legitimacy. The reign of Nero demonstrated both the potential and the dangers of imperial mythology, as the emperor's identification with Apollo and his claims to artistic and divine inspiration created a mythological framework that justified increasingly erratic behaviour. Nero's construction of the Domus Aurea a vast palace complex that incorporated elaborate mythological decorations and religious symbolism, represented the physical manifestation of imperial mythology taken to its logical extreme. The palace's famous rotating dining room, designed to mimic the movement of the heavens, created a space where the emperor could literally dine among the gods, while its elaborate frescoes depicted scenes from classical mythology that emphasized themes of divine transformation and apotheosis. The establishment of new mythological narratives connecting Roman imperial destiny with divine providence required the systematic reinterpretation of traditional Roman religious concepts. The concept of fate, which had played a relatively minor role in earlier Roman religious thought, became central to imperial mythology as a means of explaining and justifying the concentration of power in imperial hands. Imperial propagandists developed elaborate theological frameworks that presented the emperor as the agent of divine fate, chosen by the gods to guide Rome toward its destined greatness. This mythological framework required careful integration with existing Roman religious practices, leading to the development of new festivals and ceremonies that celebrated imperial destiny while maintaining connections to traditional Roman values. The role of divine providence in imperial mythology extended beyond simple claims to divine favour to encompass a comprehensive understanding of history as the unfolding of divine will. Imperial court historians and poets developed narratives that presented Roman history as a series of divinely guided events leading inevitably to imperial rule, while setbacks and disasters were reinterpreted as divine tests or punishments for abandoning proper religious observance. This providential interpretation of history required extensive mythological elaboration as court intellectuals worked to identify the divine forces at work in historical events and to explain how imperial rule represented the fulfillment of divine promises made to the Roman people. The cosmic dimension of imperial mythology involved the systematic connection of imperial rule to the fundamental order of the universe, drawing on Stoic philosophical concepts that presented earthly political arrangements as reflections of divine cosmic order. Imperial propagandists developed elaborate mythological frameworks that presented the emperor as the earthly representative of Jupiter, responsible for maintaining the same kind of order in human affairs that Jupiter maintained in the heavens. This cosmic mythology required sophisticated theological development, as court intellectuals worked to explain how imperial authority participated in the divine governance of the universe, while maintaining the traditional Roman understanding of the relationship between gods and mortals. The literary dimension of imperial mythological development involved the systematic patronage of poets and writers who could create and disseminate the narratives necessary to support imperial legitimacy. Augustus's patronage of Virgil, Horace, and other literary figures established a model for imperial cultural policy that would continue throughout the early empire, with successive emperors supporting writers who could contribute to the development of imperial mythology. This literary patronage required careful coordination between imperial political objectives and artistic creativity, leading to the development of new literary genres and techniques specifically designed to communicate imperial mythological themes to diverse audiences. Horace's contributions to imperial mythology focus particularly on the themes of restoration and renewal that were central to Augustus's self-presentation. His Carmen Seculare, composed for the secular games of 17 BCE, created a poetic framework that presented Augustus's reign as the beginning of a new golden age blessed by the gods. The poem's emphasis on moral renewal and divine favour provided a mythological interpretation of contemporary events that supported imperial claims while appealing to traditional Roman values. Horace's odes similarly developed mythological themes that connected imperial rule to divine approval, using classical mythological references to create sophisticated poetic frameworks for understanding contemporary political developments. Ovid's Metamorphoses, despite its author's eventual exile from Rome, contributed significantly to imperial mythological development through its comprehensive treatment of transformation themes that resonated with imperial claims to divine favour and apotheosis. The poem's final book, which traced the transformation of Julius Caesar into a god and predicted similar divine honours for Augustus, provided a mythological framework for understanding imperial deification that would influence subsequent imperial mythology. Ovid's sophisticated treatment of the relationship between divine and mortal realms created literary precedents for the complex theological questions raised by imperial cult practices. The dissemination of imperial mythological themes throughout the empire required the development of new communication strategies that could reach diverse populations with varying levels of education and cultural sophistication. Imperial propagandists employed multiple media, including coins, public inscriptions, architectural decoration, and public festivals, to communicate mythological narratives that supported imperial legitimacy. The standardization of imperial iconography ensured that mythological themes associated with imperial rule would be recognizable throughout the empire, while local adaptations allowed these themes to be integrated with existing regional religious traditions. The architectural dimension of imperial mythological propaganda involved the construction of buildings and monuments that physically embodied the mythological narrative supporting imperial rule. The Forum of Augustus, with its elaborate sculptural program depicting scenes from Roman history and mythology, created a public space where citizens could encounter the mythological frameworks that justified imperial authority. The Forum's Temple of Mars altar, dedicated to Mars the Avenger, provided a religious focus for imperial military ideology, while its surrounding colonnades displayed statues of Roman heroes that connected imperial rule to the accumulated virtue of Roman history. The development of imperial festival cycles provided regular opportunities for the public celebration of imperial mythological themes, with elaborate ceremonies that combined traditional Roman religious practices with new elements designed to honour imperial divinity. The Augustalia, celebrating Augustus's birthday, established a model for imperial festivals that would be replicated throughout the empire, while the Ludi Seculares provided opportunities for elaborate celebrations of imperial achievements and divine favour. These festivals required extensive preparation and coordination, involving priests, magistrates, and ordinary citizens in ceremonies that reinforced the mythological foundations of imperial rule. The provincial dimension of imperial cult development involved the adaptation of imperial mythological themes to local religious traditions and cultural contexts throughout the empire. Provincial assemblies constructed temples dedicated to imperial worship, while local communities developed their own versions of imperial festivals that combined Roman mythological themes with indigenous religious practices. This process of cultural adaptation required careful negotiation between imperial authorities and local religious leaders, leading to the development of syncretic religious practices that maintained imperial loyalty while respecting local traditions. The evolution of imperial mythology during the reigns of the Flavian emperors demonstrated the flexibility and adaptability of the mythological frameworks established during the Julio-Claudian period. Vespasian's rise to power following the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors required the development of new mythological narratives that could justify his rule despite his lack of connection to the established imperial dynasty. The Flavian emphasis on military virtue and practical governance led to the development of mythological themes that emphasized divine favor for competent leadership rather than hereditary claims to divine ancestry. The religious landscape of the Roman Empire during the first 3 centuries of the Common Era underwent a profound transformation as traditional Roman mythology encountered an unprecedented influx of mystery religions and Eastern cultic practices. This period witnessed the systematic integration of foreign religious systems that offered personal salvation and direct divine communion, fundamentally altering the relationship between individual believers and the divine realm. The appeal of these mystery cults lay not merely in their exotic origins, but in their promise of personal transformation and eternal salvation, concepts that traditional Roman state religion had never adequately addressed. The cult of Mithras emerged as perhaps the most significant mystery religion to penetrate Roman society, particularly among the military classes and urban populations throughout the empire. Originating in the Persian religious tradition but thoroughly adapted to Roman cultural contexts, Mithraism offered initiates a structured path towards spiritual enlightenment through a series of 7 grades of initiation, each associated with specific planetary deities and ritual requirements. The central mythological narrative of Mithraism focused on the god Mithras slaying a cosmic bull, an act that released life-giving forces into the universe and established the divine order that governed both cosmic and human affairs. Mithraic temples, known as Mithraea, were constructed as underground chambers that replicated the cosmic cave where Mithras performed his salvific act. These spaces typically featured elaborate relief sculptures depicting the tauroctony, the bull-slaying scene that formed the central focus of Mithraic worship. The iconography surrounding these representations included zodiacal symbols, planetary deities, and torch-bearing figures that created a complex mythological framework connecting individual salvation to cosmic processes. The god's birth from a rock, his subsequent adventures including the capture and sacrifice of the bull, and his eventual ascension to the heavens, provided initiates with a complete mythological cycle that explained both the origins of the universe and the means by which human beings could achieve divine favour. The exclusively male membership of Mithraic congregations reflected the religion's particular appeal to soldiers, merchants and government officials who found in its structured hierarchy an emphasis on loyalty, courage, and moral purity values that resonated with their professional obligations. The 7 grades of initiation, Corax, Nymphus, Miles, Leo, Perses, Heliodromus and Pater, provided a clear progression of spiritual development that paralleled military and administrative advancement in Roman society. Each grade involved specific ritual requirements, dietary restrictions, and ceremonial obligations that created a comprehensive religious framework governing daily life and spiritual practice. The cult of Dionysus, while possessing ancient Greek origins, underwent significant transformation during its integration into Roman religious life, evolving from its earlier associations with wine and agricultural fertility into a sophisticated mystery religion offering spiritual rebirth and communion with the divine. The Roman version of Dionysiac worship, known as the Bacchanalia, initially aroused suspicion and persecution from conservative Roman authorities who viewed its ecstatic rituals and nocturnal meetings as threats to public order and traditional morality. However, the cult's eventual acceptance and integration into Roman religious practice demonstrated the empire's capacity to accommodate foreign religious traditions when they could be adapted to support rather than undermine Roman social structures. The mythological framework of Roman Dionysiac worship centered on the god's death and resurrection, themes that provided initiates with powerful symbols of personal transformation and spiritual renewal. The ritual consumption of wine during Dionysiac ceremonies created a sacramental experience that allowed participants to commune directly with the divine, while the god's association with theatre and artistic inspiration attracted intellectuals and artists who found in Dionysiac worship a religious framework that celebrated creativity and emotional expression. The integration of Dionysiac themes into Roman funeral practices, particularly the use of Dionysiac imagery in tomb decorations and sarcophagi, demonstrated how mystery religions provided comfort and hope regarding death and afterlife that traditional Roman religion had never adequately addressed. The worship of Isis represented the most successful integration of an Egyptian deity into Roman religious practice, transforming an ancient goddess of magic and motherhood into a universal saviour figure whose cult spread throughout the Mediterranean world. The Roman version of Isis worship combined traditional Egyptian mythological elements with Hellenistic religious concepts and Roman organisational structures, creating a mystery religion that appealed to both men and women across all social classes. The goddess's mythological narrative, centred on her search for the dismembered body of her husband Osiris and her successful restoration of his life, provided a powerful symbol of divine love's triumph over death and chaos. Isis temples throughout the Roman Empire featured elaborate daily rituals that recreated the goddess's mythological adventures, while providing worshippers with opportunities for personal prayer and devotion. The morning ceremony of the opening of the temple involved priests unveiling the goddess's statue, dressing her in fine garments and offering her food and drink, creating a sense of intimate relationship between the deity and her worshippers. The afternoon ritual of the closing of the temple included prayers for the goddess's protection during the night hours, while special festivals throughout the year celebrated various aspects of her mythological cycle and divine attributes. The Navigium Isidis, celebrated annually in early March, commemorated Isis's role as protector of sailors and goddess of navigation through elaborate processions that carried a sacred ship from her temple to the harbour, where it was launched with prayers for safe voyages and abundant trade. This festival demonstrated how mystery religions could be integrated with practical Roman concerns, as the goddess's protection of maritime commerce directly supported the economic foundations of Roman prosperity. The festival's combination of religious devotion and civic celebration created a model for how foreign deities could be incorporated into Roman public life without disrupting traditional social structures. The process of mythological syncretism during this period involved the systematic identification of foreign deities with existing Roman gods, creating complex theological frameworks that preserve the essential characteristics of both traditions while establishing new synthetic divine figures. Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, emerged as perhaps the most successful syncretic deity, combining elements of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, the Persian Mithras, and the traditional Roman Sol to create a supreme solar deity whose worship appealed to both traditional Roman religious sensibilities and the growing popularity of Eastern solar cults. The elevation of Sol Invictus to supreme deity status under Emperor Aurelian in 274 CE represented the culmination of centuries of solar syncretism, as the emperor established December 25th as the official birthday of the unconquered sun and constructed a magnificent temple dedicated to his worship in Rome. The mythological framework surrounding Sol Invictus emphasized his role as the source of all life and energy, the divine force that governed the cosmic order and ensured the stability of the empire. This solar theology provided a religious foundation for imperial authority that transcended traditional Roman religious categories while maintaining connections to established mythological traditions. The Great Mother Cybele, whose cult had been officially imported to Rome during the crisis of the Second Punic War, underwent significant development during this period as her worship evolved from a state-sponsored foreign cult into a popular mystery religion, offering personal salvation and spiritual transformation. The mythological narrative of Cybele's relationship with her beloved Attis, who died and was resurrected annually, provided initiates with powerful symbols of death and rebirth that addressed fundamental human concerns about mortality and spiritual renewal. The spring festival of Cybele and Attis, known as the Hilaria, involved elaborate processions, ritual mourning for the god's death, and joyful celebrations of his resurrection that created intense emotional experiences for participants. The Taurobolium, a ritual baptism in bull's blood that formed the climax of Cybele's mysteries, provided initiates with a dramatic experience of spiritual death and rebirth that promised renewal and purification. Participants descended into a pit covered with wooden planks, where they were drenched in the blood of a bull sacrificed above them, emerging from this ordeal as spiritually reborn individuals who had participated in the cosmic cycle of death and resurrection embodied by Attis. This ritual's intensity and symbolic power attracted initiates from across the social spectrum, including wealthy Romans who funded elaborate Taurobolium ceremonies as expressions of their devotion to the Great Mother. The Egyptian god Serapis represented a unique example of deliberate religious syncretism, as this deity was consciously created by Ptolemaic rulers to combine Egyptian and Greek religious elements in a single divine figure who could appeal to both Egyptian and Hellenistic populations. The Roman adoption of Serapis worship involved further syncretic development, as the god acquired additional attributes from Roman religious traditions while maintaining his essential character as a deity of healing, wisdom, and protection. Serapis temples throughout the Roman Empire served as centers for both religious worship and intellectual activity, as the god's association with the famous Library of Alexandria made him a patron of learning and scholarship. The development of philosophical interpretations of mythology during this period reflected the growing influence of intellectual movements that sought to understand religious traditions through rational analysis and systematic theological reflection. Stoic philosophers developed sophisticated frameworks for interpreting mythological narratives as allegories of natural processes and moral principles, arguing that the stories of gods and heroes contain profound truths about the structure of the universe and the proper conduct of human life. This allegorical approach to mythology allowed educated Romans to maintain their religious traditions while satisfying their intellectual need for rational explanations of divine behavior and cosmic order. The Stoic interpretation of Jupiter as the divine logos or rational principle governing the universe provided a philosophical framework that could accommodate both traditional Roman religious practices and the growing influence of Eastern mystery religions. According to Stoic theology, all deities were manifestations of the single divine principle that governed cosmic order, making it possible to worship foreign gods without abandoning traditional Roman religious commitments. This philosophical syncretism created intellectual foundations for the religious pluralism that characterized the later Roman Empire, as educated Romans could participate in multiple religious traditions while maintaining their commitment to rational philosophical principles. Neoplatonic philosophy, developing from the work of Plotinus and his successors, provided even more sophisticated frameworks for understanding the relationship between traditional mythology and philosophical truth. Neoplatonic theologians argued that mythological narratives contained multiple levels of meaning, from literal historical accounts to symbolic representations of metaphysical principles that governed the relationship between the material and spiritual realms. This multi-layered approach to mythological interpretation allowed Neoplatonic philosophers to find profound spiritual truths in traditional religious stories, while maintaining their commitment to rigorous philosophical analysis. The tension between traditional Roman religious conservatism and the appeal of foreign mythological systems created ongoing conflicts throughout this period, as defenders of ancestral customs struggled to maintain the religious practices that had supposedly secured divine favour for Roman expansion and prosperity. Conservative religious authorities argued that the introduction of foreign deities and mystery religions represented a dangerous abandonment of the religious traditions that had made Rome great, while proponents of religious innovation claimed that the empire's success demonstrated divine approval for the integration of foreign religious elements into Roman practice. The persecution of certain mystery religions, particularly those associated with Christianity, reflected the complex relationship between religious innovation and political stability during this period. Roman authorities distinguished between foreign religions that could be integrated into existing social and political structures and those that appeared to threaten fundamental Roman values and institutions. The appeal of mystery religions offering personal salvation created particular challenges for Roman religious authorities, as these cults provided spiritual benefits that traditional Roman religion had never adequately addressed, while potentially undermining the collective religious obligations that bound Roman society together. The gradual transformation of Roman religious practice during this period reflected the empire's growing cultural diversity and the practical challenges of governing populations with vastly different religious traditions and spiritual needs. The integration of mystery religions and Eastern cultic practices created new opportunities for personal religious expression, while maintaining the public religious ceremonies that continued to provide social cohesion and political legitimacy. This religious pluralism would ultimately prepare the way for the even more dramatic religious transformations that would characterize the later empire as traditional Roman mythology continued to evolve in response to new cultural influences and spiritual challenges. The emergence of Christianity as a significant religious force within the Roman Empire during the 2nd century CE initiated a complex process of theological confrontation and cultural transformation that would fundamentally alter the relationship between traditional Roman mythology and religious practice. Unlike the mystery religions that had previously integrated into Roman religious life through syncretism and accommodation, Christianity presented itself as an exclusive theological system that demanded the complete abandonment of traditional mythological frameworks. This exclusivity created unprecedented challenges for Roman religious authorities and initiated a prolonged period of theological conflict that would ultimately reshape the entire mythological landscape of the Mediterranean world. The early Christian critique of Roman mythology focused primarily on the moral inadequacies and logical contradictions inherent in traditional divine narratives. Christian apologists like Justin Martyr and Athenagoras systematically examined the mythological cycles surrounding Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and other major Roman deities, arguing that their depictions of divine adultery, violence, and deception made them unsuitable as objects of worship for rational human beings. These critiques gained particular force because they employed the same philosophical methods that educated Romans had used to interpret their own mythological traditions, turning the tools of classical education against the religious foundations of Roman culture. The Christian argument against mythological polytheism extended beyond moral criticism to encompass fundamental theological principles that challenged the entire conceptual framework of Roman religious thought. Christian theologians argued that the multiplicity of gods in Roman mythology reflected human confusion about the nature of divine reality rather than accurate knowledge of the spiritual realm. They contended that the conflicts and competitions between different deities in mythological narratives demonstrated the inadequacy of polytheistic systems to provide coherent explanations of cosmic order and divine providence. This theological critique proved particularly effective among educated Romans who had already encountered philosophical criticisms of traditional mythology through Stoic and Platonic intellectual traditions. The process of demonization that characterized Christian responses to Roman mythology involved the systematic reinterpretation of traditional deities as malevolent spiritual beings who had deceived humanity into false worship. Christian theologians like Tertullian and Origen developed elaborate frameworks that explained the apparent power and influence of Roman gods as the result of demonic activity rather than genuine divine authority. According to these interpretations, the deities worshipped in Roman temples were actually demons who had assumed false identities to lead human beings away from the worship of the true God. This demonization process allowed Christians to acknowledge the reality of supernatural phenomena associated with traditional Roman religion while denying the legitimacy of polytheistic worship. The theological framework of demonization required careful development to address the obvious question of why demons would be permitted to exercise such extensive influence over human affairs. Christian theologians drew upon biblical narratives about fallen angels and demonic rebellion to create comprehensive explanations of how evil spiritual beings had gained temporary authority over the material world. They argued that God had permitted demonic deception as a test of human faith and as punishment for humanity's original disobedience, while maintaining that divine providence would ultimately triumph over demonic influence through the redemptive work of Christ. The transformation of specific Roman deities into demonic figures involved detailed theological analysis of their mythological attributes and cultic practices. Jupiter, as the supreme deity of the Roman pantheon, received particular attention from Christian demonologists who reinterpreted his role as king of the gods as evidence of his position as the chief demon who had organized the systematic deception of humanity. His mythological associations with thunder and lightning were explained as manifestations of his true nature as a destructive spiritual force, while his numerous sexual liaisons were presented as evidence of his fundamentally corrupt character. The elaborate rituals associated with Jupiter's worship were reinterpreted as demonic ceremonies designed to bind human beings to false spiritual allegiances. Mars underwent similar transformation in Christian theological interpretation, as his role as god of war was reinterpreted as evidence of his demonic nature and his desire to promote violence and conflict among human beings. Christian theologians argued that Mars's influence over Roman military culture had led to the empire's aggressive expansion and the countless deaths that resulted from Roman warfare. They contended that the god's apparent favour toward Roman armies represented demonic deception, designed to promote human destruction rather than genuine divine blessing. The ritual practices associated with Mars worship, including animal sacrifice and military ceremonies, were reinterpreted as demonic rituals that bound Roman soldiers to evil spiritual forces. Venus received extensive attention from Christian critics who viewed her mythological associations with sexual desire and physical beauty as particularly dangerous forms of demonic temptation. Christian theologians argued that Venus's influence over human romantic relationships represented a systematic attempt to corrupt human sexuality and undermine the moral foundations of family life. They interpreted her mythological narratives as allegorical descriptions of how demonic forces used physical attraction and sexual desire to lead human beings away from spiritual devotion and moral purity. The elaborate festivals associated with Venus worship were reinterpreted as demonic celebrations that promoted sexual immorality and social corruption. The process of mythological reinterpretation under Christian influence involved not merely the demonization of traditional deities, but also the systematic appropriation of useful mythological themes and narrative structures for Christian theological purposes. Christian theologians recognized that many elements of Roman mythology contained profound truths about human nature and cosmic order that could be separated from their polytheistic contexts and employed in Christian theological frameworks. This process of selective appropriation allowed Christianity to maintain cultural continuity with classical traditions while fundamentally transforming their religious significance. The mythological theme of divine sacrifice, which appeared in various forms throughout Roman religious traditions, provided Christian theologians with powerful precedents for understanding the redemptive significance of Christ's death. The stories of deities like Attis and Adonis, who died and were resurrected annually, were reinterpreted as demonic parodies of the true divine sacrifice that would be accomplished through Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Christian apologists argued that demons had inspired these mythological narratives as part of their systematic attempt to confuse humanity about the nature of divine redemption, creating false versions of the true salvation that would be provided through Christ. The concept of divine incarnation, which had appeared in various forms throughout Roman mythology, was similarly appropriated and transformed by Christian theologians, who argued that the true incarnation of God in human form had been accomplished through Christ, rather than through the various divine human figures of classical mythology. The stories of gods assuming human form or being born from human mothers were reinterpreted as demonic counterfeits of the true incarnation, designed to prepare humanity for the acceptance of false claims to divine authority. This theological framework allowed Christians to acknowledge the widespread presence of incarnation themes in classical culture while maintaining the uniqueness of Christian incarnational theology. The gradual replacement of pagan mythological narratives with Christian theological frameworks accelerated dramatically following Constantine's conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century CE. Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 CE, which granted legal recognition to Christianity throughout the empire, created new opportunities for Christian theologians to develop systematic critiques of traditional Roman mythology while promoting Christian alternatives. The emperor's personal patronage of Christian institutions and his active participation in theological controversies provided unprecedented support for the development of Christian intellectual traditions that could compete effectively with classical philosophical and religious systems. The Constantinian transformation of Roman religious policy involved not merely the legal recognition of Christianity, but also the systematic withdrawal of imperial support from traditional Roman religious institutions. Constantine's decision to cease funding traditional Roman temples and festivals created practical pressures that accelerated the decline of classical mythological traditions while providing resources for the development of Christian alternatives. The emperor's construction of elaborate Christian churches, including the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, created new architectural frameworks for Christian worship that rivaled the magnificence of traditional Roman temples. The theological controversies that characterized the 4th century CE, particularly the Arian controversy concerning the relationship between Christ and God the Father, required Christian theologians to develop increasingly sophisticated frameworks for understanding divine nature and cosmic order. These theological developments provided alternatives to traditional Roman mythological explanations of divine relationships and cosmic processes, while the public debates surrounding these controversies familiarized ordinary Romans with Christian theological concepts that had previously been confined to educated Christian communities. The role of church fathers like Augustine of Hippo in systematically refuting pagan mythology while incorporating useful philosophical elements represented the culmination of centuries of Christian intellectual development. Augustine's City of God, written in response to pagan claims that the sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 CE resulted from the abandonment of traditional Roman religious practices, provided a comprehensive Christian critique of Roman mythology and political ideology. Augustine's analysis of Roman religious traditions demonstrated extensive knowledge of classical mythological sources while systematically undermining their theological foundations and moral authority. Augustine's approach to classical mythology involved careful distinction between the mythological narratives themselves and the philosophical insights that could be extracted from them. He argued that many classical philosophers had achieved genuine understanding of divine truth despite their involvement in polytheistic religious systems, suggesting that divine providence had prepared the intellectual foundations for Christian theology through the work of pagan philosophers. This approach allowed Augustine to appropriate useful elements from classical intellectual traditions while maintaining his critique of polytheistic religious practices. The Augustinian synthesis of Christian theology and classical philosophy created intellectual frameworks that could satisfy both the spiritual needs addressed by mystery religions and the rational requirements demanded by educated Romans. Augustine's psychological analysis of human nature, his understanding of divine providence and human history, and his sophisticated treatment of the relationship between faith and reason provided comprehensive alternatives to the mythological frameworks that had previously structured Roman religious thought. His influence on subsequent Christian theological development ensured that these synthetic approaches would continue to shape Christian responses to classical mythology throughout the later empire. The preservation and transformation of classical mythological themes through Christian allegory and moral instruction involved the systematic reinterpretation of traditional narratives as symbolic representations of Christian theological principles. Christian educators recognized that the mythological stories familiar to educated Romans could serve as effective vehicles for communicating Christian moral and theological concepts, provided that their polytheistic elements were carefully reinterpreted or eliminated. This process of allegorical transformation allowed Christian culture to maintain continuity with classical educational traditions while fundamentally altering their religious significance. The development of Christian allegorical interpretation of classical mythology drew upon existing traditions of philosophical allegory that had been employed by Stoic and Platonic interpreters of mythological narratives. Christian allegorists like Clement of Alexandria and Origen developed sophisticated hermeneutical methods that could extract Christian theological meaning from classical mythological sources while acknowledging their originally pagan contexts. These interpretive methods allowed Christian educators to employ classical mythological narratives as teaching tools while maintaining their theological commitments to Christian exclusivity. The gradual transformation of Roman educational practices under Christian influence involved the systematic replacement of traditional mythological content with Christian alternatives, while maintaining the literary and rhetorical skills that had characterized classical education. Christian educators developed new textbooks and curricula that employed biblical narratives and Christian theological concepts as the primary content for literary and rhetorical instruction, while classical mythological references were retained primarily as historical and cultural background, rather than as authoritative religious sources. The architectural transformation of Roman religious spaces under Christian influence involved the systematic conversion of traditional temples into Christian churches, a process that required careful theological justification and practical adaptation. Christian authorities developed elaborate purification rituals designed to cleanse former pagan temples of their demonic associations while preserving their architectural magnificence for Christian worship. This process of architectural conversion created physical manifestations of the theological transformation that was occurring throughout Roman religious culture, as spaces that had previously housed the worship of traditional Roman deities were transformed into centres of Christian theological instruction and spiritual practice. The festival calendar of the later Roman Empire underwent systematic transformation as Christian authorities replaced traditional Roman religious celebrations with Christian alternatives that maintained popular appeal while promoting Christian theological themes. The celebration of Christmas on December 25th, which coincided with the traditional Roman festival of Sol Invictus, exemplified this process of calendrical transformation as Christian authorities appropriated the popular solar symbolism associated with the winter solstice, while redirecting its religious significance toward the celebration of Christ's birth. Similar transformations occurred throughout the Roman festival calendar, as Christian celebrations gradually replaced traditional Roman religious observances while maintaining their social and cultural functions. The intellectual legacy of this transformation period established the foundations for medieval European approaches to classical mythology that would persist for centuries. The Christian theological frameworks developed during the 4th and 5th centuries CE provided the interpretive methods that would be employed by medieval scholars in their encounters with classical mythological sources, while the allegorical traditions established during this period created the hermeneutical foundations for understanding classical mythology as a source of moral and philosophical instruction rather than religious authority. This intellectual transformation ensured that classical Roman mythology would survive the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, albeit in forms that had been fundamentally altered by Christian theological interpretation and moral instruction. The collapse of centralized Roman authority in the Western Empire during the 5th century created an unprecedented crisis for the preservation of classical mythological knowledge, as the institutional structures that had maintained and transmitted these traditions for centuries suddenly disappeared. The barbarian invasions, political fragmentation, and economic disruption that characterized this period threatened to destroy the accumulated literary and scholarly heritage of Roman civilization, including the vast corpus of mythological texts that had been carefully preserved in libraries throughout the empire. However, the Christian Church, which had previously worked to replace pagan mythology with Christian theology, now found itself in the unexpected position of becoming the primary guardian of classical learning, including the very mythological traditions it had once sought to eliminate. The monastic scriptoriums that emerged throughout medieval Europe became the crucial repositories for classical mythological texts, as monks laboured to copy and preserve manuscripts that might otherwise have been lost forever. The monastery of Monte Cassino, founded by Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, established a model for manuscript preservation that would be replicated throughout the medieval world. The scriptorium at Monte Cassino housed copies of Virgil's Aeneid, Ovid's Metamorphoses, and numerous other classical texts containing mythological content, while the monastery's library catalogue from the 9th century reveals the systematic effort to preserve works that were considered essential to educated discourse despite their pagan origins. The process of manuscript copying in medieval scriptoriums involved far more than simple transcription, as monks frequently added glosses, commentaries, and interpretive notes that reflected contemporary Christian understanding of classical mythological content. These marginal annotations provide valuable insight into how medieval scholars approached pagan mythology, often employing allegorical interpretation to extract Christian moral lessons from classical narratives. A 9th century manuscript of Ovid's Metamorphoses from the monastery of St. Gall contains extensive marginal notes that reinterpret the transformation stories as allegories of Christian spiritual development, while maintaining the original Latin text for its literary and educational value. The preservation efforts at the monastery of Bobbio, founded by the Irish monk Columbanus in 614, demonstrate the international character of medieval manuscript preservation. The monastery's library contained texts from throughout the former Roman Empire, including rare copies of classical mythological works that had survived the various barbarian invasions and political upheavals. The monks at Bobbio developed sophisticated techniques for restoring damaged manuscripts, often combining fragments from multiple sources to create complete texts. Their catalogue from the 10th century lists over 700 manuscripts, including numerous works containing Roman mythological content that would have been lost without their preservation efforts. The development of medieval allegorical interpretation represented a fundamental transformation in how classical mythology was understood and transmitted. Christian scholars recognized that the mythological narratives preserved in classical texts contained moral and philosophical insights that could be separated from their original pagan religious contexts and employed for Christian educational purposes. This allegorical approach allowed medieval educators to maintain classical literary traditions while ensuring that their content supported rather than undermined Christian theological principles. The allegorical interpretation of Jupiter's mythological narratives exemplified this transformative process, as medieval scholars reinterpreted the king of the gods as a symbol of divine authority and cosmic order, rather than as a pagan deity deserving worship. The 12th century scholar Bernard Silvestris, in his commentary on Virgil's Aeneid, presented Jupiter's role in guiding Aeneas's journey as an allegory of divine providence directing human affairs toward redemptive purposes. This interpretation allowed medieval readers to appreciate the literary sophistication of classical mythology while understanding its theological significance within a Christian framework. Venus underwent similar allegorical transformation in medieval interpretation, as scholars reinterpreted her mythological associations with love and beauty as symbols of divine love and spiritual beauty, rather than as encouragements to physical desire. The 11th century scholar Fulbert of Chartres developed elaborate allegorical frameworks that presented Venus's relationship with Mars as a symbolic representation of the proper relationship between divine love and righteous warfare, while her role as mother of Aeneas was interpreted as a prefiguration of Mary's role as mother of Christ. These interpretations allowed medieval scholars to employ classical mythological narratives as vehicles for Christian theological instruction, while maintaining their literary and cultural significance. The role of Carolingian scholars in maintaining continuity with classical mythological traditions proved crucial for the survival of these materials during the early medieval period. Charlemagne's court school at Aachen, established in the late 8th century, brought together scholars from throughout Europe to preserve and study classical texts, including works containing extensive mythological content. Alcuin of York, who served as the court school's director, developed educational curricula that employed classical mythological narratives as teaching tools, while ensuring that their content was properly interpreted within Christian theological frameworks. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 9th century witnessed unprecedented efforts to collect, copy and preserve classical manuscripts, as scholars recognized that these texts contained essential knowledge for understanding the foundations of European civilization. The court library at Aachen contained copies of virtually every major classical work that had survived the barbarian invasions, including complete collections of mythological texts that would serve as the sources for subsequent medieval scholarship. The systematic copying programs initiated during this period created multiple copies of crucial texts, ensuring their survival even when individual manuscripts were lost to fire, warfare, or natural decay. The scholarly network that developed during the Carolingian period extended throughout the emerging European kingdoms, creating channels for the transmission of classical mythological knowledge that transcended political boundaries. The monastery of Saint Riquier in northern France maintained extensive correspondence with scholars at Aachen, Monte Cassino, and other centres of learning, facilitating the exchange of manuscripts and scholarly interpretations. These networks ensured that classical mythological texts remained accessible to educated Europeans, even as political fragmentation made centralised preservation efforts increasingly difficult. The contribution of Islamic translators and scholars to the preservation of classical mythological traditions represents one of the most significant yet often overlooked aspects of medieval cultural transmission. The Islamic conquest of former Roman territories in North Africa and Spain brought Muslim scholars into contact with classical texts that had been preserved in Christian monasteries and private libraries. These scholars, working in translation centres at Baghdad, Cordoba, and other Islamic cultural centres, produced Arabic translations of classical works that often preserved textual variants that had been lost in European manuscripts. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established during the 9th century, became a major centre for the translation and preservation of classical texts, including works containing mythological content. Islamic scholars like Hunayn ibn Ishaq developed sophisticated translation techniques that preserve not only the literal meaning of classical texts, but also their literary and cultural significance. The Arabic translations produced at Baghdad often included extensive commentaries that explained classical mythological references for Muslim readers, creating interpretive frameworks that would later influence European understanding of these materials. The transmission of classical mythological knowledge through Islamic scholarly networks created unexpected opportunities for cultural exchange and intellectual development. The 12th century scholar Averroes, working in Cordoba, produced commentaries on classical texts that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mythological symbolism and its relationship to philosophical truth. His interpretations of classical mythology as allegorical representations of natural processes and cosmic principles influenced subsequent European scholarship, particularly through the work of scholars like Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, who encountered his writings through Latin translations. The preservation of classical texts in Islamic libraries often involved their integration with other cultural traditions, creating synthetic approaches to mythological interpretation that combined classical, Islamic, and Jewish scholarly methods. The library at Cordoba contained translations of classical mythological works alongside Islamic philosophical texts and Jewish biblical commentaries, creating opportunities for comparative analysis that enriched understanding of all three traditions. These synthetic approaches to mythological interpretation would later influence European Renaissance scholarship when these materials became available through Christian reconquest and cultural exchange. The emergence of vernacular literature, incorporating Roman mythological themes, marked a crucial development in the medieval transformation of classical traditions. The courtly romance tradition that developed in 12th century France drew extensively upon classical mythological narratives while adapting them to reflect contemporary social values and religious concerns. The romance of Aeneas, composed around 1160, retold Virgil's Aeneid in Old French verse, while incorporating chivalric ideals and Christian theological themes that made the classical narrative accessible to medieval aristocratic audiences. The Matter of Rome, one of the three major literary traditions of medieval romance, encompassed a vast corpus of vernacular works that retold classical mythological narratives for contemporary audiences. These works, including the Roman de Troyes by Benoit de Saint-Maur and the Roman de Thibes by an anonymous author, demonstrated the continued appeal of classical mythological themes while showing how these narratives could be adapted to reflect medieval social structures and moral concerns. The transformation of classical heroes into medieval knights and classical gods into allegorical figures representing Christian virtues exemplified the creative adaptation that characterized medieval approaches to mythological material. The development of epic poetry in vernacular languages provided another vehicle for the transmission and transformation of classical mythological themes. The Chanson de Roland, while primarily concerned with Christian warfare against Islamic forces, incorporated mythological elements that connected contemporary military conflicts with classical traditions of heroic warfare. The poem's presentation of Charlemagne as a new Aeneas, divinely chosen to establish Christian dominion over former pagan territories, demonstrated how classical mythological frameworks could be employed to legitimize medieval political and religious objectives. The courtly culture that developed in 12th century France created new audiences for mythological narratives that had been adapted to reflect aristocratic values and social concerns. The courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Marie de Champagne became centres for the development of vernacular literature that employed classical mythological themes while addressing contemporary issues of love, honour, and social obligation. The patronage provided by these aristocratic courts enabled poets and scholars to develop sophisticated literary works that made classical mythology accessible to audiences who lack the Latin education necessary to read original classical texts. The transformation of classical mythological narratives in vernacular literature involved systematic adaptation of their moral and theological content to reflect Christian values and medieval social structures. The story of Dido and Aeneas, as retold in the 12th century Roman Aeneas, was modified to emphasize the conflict between personal desire and divine duty, while Dido's tragic fate was reinterpreted as a cautionary tale about the dangers of placing earthly love above spiritual obligations. These adaptations allowed medieval audiences to appreciate the emotional power of classical narratives while understanding their significance within Christian moral frameworks. The development of allegorical interpretation in vernacular literature created new opportunities for the transmission of classical mythological knowledge to audiences who lacked formal education in Latin or classical literature. The 12th century Ovid Moralis, a French adaptation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, provided detailed allegorical interpretations of classical transformation stories that explained their significance as Christian moral lessons. This work, which extended to over 70,000 lines of verse, demonstrated the medieval appetite for classical mythological content, while showing how these narratives could be thoroughly Christianized without losing their literary appeal. The integration of classical mythological themes into medieval educational curricula represented another crucial aspect of their preservation and transformation. The cathedral schools that developed during the 11th and 12th centuries employed classical texts, including works containing mythological content, as the foundation for instruction in grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic. Students at the Cathedral School of Chartres studied Virgil's Aeneid not only for its literary merit but also for its mythological content, which was interpreted as providing insights into natural philosophy and moral development. The scholarly method that developed in medieval schools involved the systematic analysis of classical texts through multiple interpretive lenses, creating comprehensive approaches to mythological material that preserved its literary significance, while extracting its moral and philosophical content. The 12th century scholar Thierry of Chartres developed educational programs that employed classical mythological narratives as vehicles for instruction in natural philosophy, arguing that the stories of gods and heroes contained allegorical representations of cosmic processes and natural phenomena. This approach allowed medieval students to study classical mythology as a source of scientific and philosophical knowledge while maintaining their Christian theological commitments. The development of medieval libraries and scriptoriums created institutional frameworks for the continued preservation and transmission of classical mythological texts throughout the period. The library at the Cathedral of Chartres, which contained over 300 manuscripts by the 12th century, included extensive collections of classical works that were regularly consulted by students and scholars. The systematic cataloguing and preservation efforts undertaken by medieval librarians ensured that these texts remained accessible to subsequent generations, while their integration into educational curricula guaranteed their continued transmission and interpretation. The manuscript illumination tradition that developed in medieval scriptoriums created new visual representations of classical mythological narratives that made their content accessible to audiences who could not read Latin texts. The illuminated manuscripts of Ovid's Metamorphoses produced at various European monasteries during the 11th and 12th centuries contained elaborate illustrations that depicted classical transformation stories while incorporating Christian symbolic elements. These visual representations allowed medieval audiences to encounter classical mythology through artistic media while ensuring that its content was properly interpreted within Christian theological frameworks. The preservation of classical mythological knowledge through medieval institutions created the foundation for the Renaissance recovery of classical learning that would occur during the 14th and 15th centuries. The manuscripts preserved in monastic libraries, the allegorical interpretations developed by medieval scholars, and the vernacular adaptations created for courtly audiences all contributed to maintaining the continuity of classical mythological traditions during the centuries when direct knowledge of classical civilization had been largely lost. The institutional frameworks developed during the medieval period for preserving, interpreting, and transmitting classical knowledge would prove crucial for the more systematic recovery of classical learning that characterized the Renaissance period. The intellectual transformation that swept through Europe during the 14th century fundamentally altered the relationship between classical Roman mythology and contemporary scholarship, as humanist scholars began to approach ancient texts with unprecedented critical rigor and historical awareness. This shift represented a dramatic departure from the medieval allegorical tradition, which had interpreted mythological narratives primarily as vehicles for Christian moral instruction. Instead, Renaissance humanists sought to understand Roman mythology within its original historical context, employing philological methods and comparative analysis to recover authentic classical knowledge that had been obscured by centuries of Christian reinterpretation. The recovery of classical manuscripts from monastic libraries and Byzantine collections provided Renaissance scholars with access to mythological texts that had been largely unknown during the medieval period. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 brought a flood of Greek manuscripts to Western Europe, while systematic searches of monastery libraries revealed Latin texts that had been preserved but neglected for centuries. Cardinal Bessarion's donation of his manuscript collection to Venice in 1468 included numerous works containing mythological content, while the library assembled by Cosimo de' Medici in Florence became a major centre for the study of classical mythology and its relationship to ancient religious practices. The humanist scholar Poggio Bracciolini exemplified this new approach to classical recovery through his systematic exploration of monastery libraries throughout Europe. His discovery of complete manuscripts of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura and Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria in the monastery of St. Gall demonstrated the wealth of classical knowledge that remained hidden in medieval collections. Bracciolini's careful transcription and circulation of these texts provided Renaissance scholars with access to sophisticated discussions of Roman religious practices and mythological interpretations that had been unavailable to medieval readers. His correspondence with other humanist scholars reveals the excitement generated by these discoveries and their impact on contemporary understanding of classical civilization. The development of critical philological methods during the Renaissance enabled scholars to approach mythological texts with unprecedented analytical sophistication. Lorenzo Valla's demonstration that the donation of Constantine was a medieval forgery established new standards for textual criticism that would be applied to classical mythological sources. His analysis of linguistic evidence and historical context provided models for evaluating the authenticity and reliability of ancient texts, while his work on the Latin language revealed how changes in vocabulary and syntax could illuminate the historical development of mythological concepts. Valla's approach to textual criticism influenced subsequent generations of scholars who applied similar methods to the study of Roman mythology and its transmission through medieval sources. The humanist emphasis on returning to original sources led to systematic efforts to distinguish authentic classical mythological narratives from their medieval adaptations and Christian interpretations. Scholars like Angelo Poliziano developed sophisticated methods for identifying interpolations and modifications in classical texts, while their knowledge of Greek enabled them to compare Latin mythological sources with their Greek originals. Poliziano's lectures on classical poetry at the University of Florence demonstrated how careful textual analysis could reveal the historical development of mythological narratives and their relationship to ancient religious practices. His students, including Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, continued this tradition of rigorous textual scholarship while developing new approaches to understanding the philosophical dimensions of classical mythology. The printing revolution that began in the mid-15th century transformed the dissemination of classical mythological knowledge throughout Europe. The first printed edition of Ovid's Metamorphoses, published in Bologna in 1471, made this crucial mythological text widely available for the first time since antiquity. The Aldine Press in Venice, established by Aldus Manutius, specialized in producing high-quality editions of classical texts that incorporated the latest humanist scholarship. Manutius's editions of Virgil, Horace, and other classical authors containing mythological content established textual standards that would influence scholarly understanding of Roman mythology for centuries. The relatively low cost of printed books compared to manuscript copies enabled scholars throughout Europe to build personal libraries containing comprehensive collections of classical mythological sources. The standardization of classical texts through printing created new opportunities for comparative analysis and systematic study of mythological traditions. Scholars could now compare different versions of the same mythological narratives, identify variations in different sources, and trace the development of specific mythological themes across multiple authors and historical periods. The availability of complete editions of classical authors enabled Renaissance scholars to understand individual mythological narratives within their broader literary and cultural contexts, while the production of concordances and indices made it possible to conduct systematic studies of mythological themes and their treatment by different classical authors. The artistic renaissance that accompanied the recovery of classical learning provided new venues for the visual representation of Roman mythological themes. The decoration of the Sistine Chapel, completed between 1508 and 1512, incorporated classical mythological elements alongside Christian imagery, demonstrating how Renaissance artists could employ pagan mythological themes to enhance rather than compete with Christian religious content. Michelangelo's ceiling frescoes included representations of classical sibyls alongside biblical prophets, while his depiction of the creation of Adam drew upon classical artistic traditions that had been informed by mythological understanding of divine-human relationships. The development of Renaissance artistic theory involved systematic study of classical sources that described ancient approaches to mythological representation. Leon Battista Alberti's treatises on painting and sculpture drew extensively upon classical authors like Pliny the Elder and Vitruvius, whose works contain detailed descriptions of how ancient artists had depicted mythological subjects. Alberti's analysis of classical artistic principles provided Renaissance artists with theoretical frameworks for creating mythological representations that would be both aesthetically sophisticated and historically accurate. His emphasis on the importance of understanding mythological narratives and their symbolic significance influenced generations of Renaissance artists who sought to create works that demonstrated their mastery of classical learning. The patronage system that characterized Renaissance culture created unprecedented opportunities for the artistic representation of classical mythological themes. The Medici family's support for artists and scholars in Florence enabled the creation of works that combined sophisticated classical learning with artistic innovation. Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus, commissioned for the villa of Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, demonstrated how Renaissance artists could employ classical mythological themes to create works that appealed to contemporary aesthetic sensibilities while displaying their knowledge of ancient sources. The painting's sophisticated iconographic program, which drew upon multiple classical sources including Ovid, Lucretius, and Apuleius, exemplified the Renaissance integration of artistic creativity and humanist scholarship. The spread of Renaissance artistic techniques throughout Europe facilitated the dissemination of classical mythological themes beyond their Italian origins. The court of Francis in France became a major centre for the artistic representation of classical mythology, while the patronage of Charles V and Philip II in Spain supported artists who specialised in mythological subjects. The international character of Renaissance artistic culture ensured that classical mythological themes would be interpreted and represented according to local artistic traditions and cultural concerns, creating diverse regional variations while maintaining connections to authentic classical sources. The development of comparative mythology during the Renaissance represented a revolutionary approach to understanding religious traditions and their historical relationships. Scholars like Natale Conti began systematic efforts to compare Roman mythological narratives with those of other ancient cultures, seeking to identify common themes and underlying principles that might reveal universal truths about human nature and divine reality. Conti's Mythologiae, first published in 1567, provided comprehensive analysis of classical mythological traditions while comparing them with Egyptian, Persian, and Germanic religious narratives. His work established methodological frameworks for comparative mythological study that would influence subsequent scholarship for centuries. The humanist approach to comparative mythology involved careful attention to historical context and cultural specificity, avoiding the medieval tendency to interpret all mythological narratives as variations of Christian theological themes. Renaissance scholars recognized that different cultures had developed distinct mythological traditions that reflected their particular historical experiences and cultural values, while acknowledging that certain universal human concerns had led to similar mythological themes across different societies. This historical sensitivity enabled Renaissance scholars to appreciate the distinctive characteristics of Roman mythology while understanding its relationship to broader patterns of human religious development. The scholarly networks that developed during the Renaissance facilitated international collaboration in the study of classical mythology and its relationship to ancient religious practices. The correspondence between scholars like Erasmus, Bude and Scaliger reveals the extent to which Renaissance humanists shared information about manuscript discoveries, textual interpretations, and methodological innovations. These scholarly exchanges created cumulative traditions of mythological research that transcended national boundaries and institutional affiliations, while the mobility of Renaissance scholars ensured that new discoveries and interpretations would be rapidly disseminated throughout the European intellectual community. The establishment of universities and academies throughout Renaissance Europe provided institutional frameworks for the systematic study of classical mythology and its historical significance. The University of Paris developed curricula that emphasized the historical study of classical texts, while the Platonic Academy in Florence created forums for philosophical discussion of mythological themes and their relationship to ancient wisdom traditions. These institutional developments ensured that the Renaissance recovery of classical learning would be sustained through formal educational programs rather than depending solely on individual scholarly initiative. The development of Renaissance educational theory involved systematic reconsideration of the role that classical mythology should play in contemporary curricula. Humanist educators like Vittorino da Feltre developed pedagogical approaches that employed classical mythological texts as vehicles for instruction in language, literature, and moral philosophy, while ensuring that students understood their historical context and cultural significance. The educational programs developed at Vittorino's school in Mantua became models for humanist education throughout Europe, demonstrating how classical mythological knowledge could be integrated into contemporary educational practice without compromising Christian theological commitments. The printing of mythological handbooks and reference works during the Renaissance created new resources for scholars and educated readers who sought systematic knowledge of classical mythological traditions. Lelio Gregorio Giraldi's De Deus Gentium, published in 1548, provided comprehensive coverage of classical deities and their mythological narratives, while Vincenzo Carteri's Immagini dei degli Antichi offered detailed descriptions of how ancient gods had been represented in classical art and literature. These reference works made classical mythological knowledge accessible to readers who lacked the linguistic skills necessary to consult original classical sources, while their systematic organisation facilitated comparative study of mythological themes and their treatment by different ancient authors. The Renaissance development of emblem books and allegorical literature created new venues for the interpretation and application of classical mythological themes. Andrea Alciati's Emblemata, first published in 1531, employed classical mythological images and narratives to illustrate moral and philosophical principles, while maintaining scholarly accuracy in its treatment of ancient sources. The popularity of emblem books throughout Renaissance Europe demonstrated the continued appeal of classical mythological themes, while their integration of visual and textual elements created new opportunities for the artistic representation of mythological content. The influence of Renaissance mythological scholarship on contemporary literature and artistic production extended far beyond academic circles to encompass popular culture and artistic patronage. The mythological themes that have been recovered and systematized by humanist scholars provided inspiration for poets, painters, and architects who sought to create works that demonstrated their mastery of classical learning while appealing to contemporary audiences. The integration of classical mythological knowledge into Renaissance artistic production created cultural frameworks that would influence European artistic development for centuries, while the scholarly methods developed during this period established foundations for modern approaches to the study of ancient religions and mythological traditions. The systematic approach to mythological study that emerged during the Renaissance involved the development of new scholarly tools and methodological frameworks that enabled unprecedented analytical sophistication. The creation of comprehensive indices, concordances, and comparative tables allowed scholars to trace the development of specific mythological themes across multiple sources and historical periods, while the application of philological methods to mythological texts revealed previously unrecognized connections between different narrative traditions. These methodological innovations established the Renaissance as a crucial period in the development of systematic approaches to mythological study that would continue to influence scholarly practice into the modern era. The intellectual revolution that swept through Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries fundamentally challenged the authority of traditional mythological narratives, as Enlightenment philosophers and scholars subjected Roman mythology to unprecedented rational scrutiny. This period witnessed the emergence of systematic methodologies for analysing religious traditions through empirical observation and logical reasoning, marking a decisive break from the Renaissance humanist approach that had sought to recover and appreciate classical learning within existing cultural frameworks. Instead, Enlightenment thinkers approached Roman mythology as a historical phenomenon requiring scientific explanation rather than reverential preservation. The French philosopher Bernard de Fontenelle's treatise On the Origin of Fables established foundational principles for the rational analysis of mythological traditions that would influence subsequent Enlightenment scholarship. Fontenelle argued that mythological narratives originated from primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena through supernatural causation, representing humanity's earliest but fundamentally flawed efforts to understand the physical world. His analysis of Roman mythology focused on identifying the natural phenomena that had inspired specific divine narratives, arguing that Jupiter's association with thunder and lightning reflected ancient observations of meteorological events that lacked scientific explanation. This approach transformed mythological study from literary appreciation to anthropological investigation, treating Roman gods as historical artifacts rather than cultural treasures. The systematic application of rational analysis to mythological traditions required the development of new scholarly methodologies that could distinguish between authentic historical information and fictional elaboration. The German scholar Christian Gottlob Hein pioneered the use of comparative linguistics to trace the historical development of mythological concepts, demonstrating how changes in language could reveal the evolution of religious ideas across different cultures and time periods. His analysis of Latin mythological terminology showed how Roman religious concepts had been influenced by Greek, Etruscan, and indigenous Italic traditions, providing empirical evidence for the syncretic processes that had shaped Roman mythology. Heine's linguistic approach enabled scholars to identify specific historical influences on mythological development, while avoiding the speculative interpretations that had characterized earlier scholarship. The emergence of natural philosophy as a systematic discipline during the scientific revolution provided new frameworks for understanding the relationship between mythological narratives and physical reality. Isaac Newton's mathematical description of celestial mechanics offered rational explanations for astronomical phenomena that had previously been attributed to divine intervention, while his analysis of gravitational forces provided scientific alternatives to mythological accounts of cosmic order. The application of Newtonian physics to mythological interpretation led scholars to reinterpret Jupiter's role as king of the gods as a primitive personification of gravitational attraction, while Mars's association with warfare was explained as an ancient observation of the planet's red coloration and erratic orbital behaviour. The development of empirical approaches to historical investigation enabled Enlightenment scholars to subject mythological sources to rigorous critical analysis. The Italian scholar Giambattista Vico's New Science established methodological principles for understanding the relationship between mythological narratives and historical development, arguing that mythological traditions preserved authentic information about ancient societies despite their supernatural elaborations. Vico's analysis of Roman mythology focused on identifying the social and political conditions that had shaped specific mythological narratives, demonstrating how stories about gods and heroes reflected the values and concerns of the societies that created them. His approach enabled scholars to extract historical information from mythological sources while maintaining critical distance from their supernatural claims. The French Encyclopédie, compiled by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert between 1751 and 1772, represented the culmination of Enlightenment efforts to systematize human knowledge according to rational principles. The encyclopedia's treatment of Roman mythology exemplified the period's approach to traditional religious narratives, presenting them as historical curiosities rather than sources of spiritual or moral instruction. The article on mythology defined the subject as the science of fables and emphasized the importance of understanding mythological traditions as products of specific historical circumstances rather than timeless truths about human nature or divine reality. This encyclopedic approach to mythological knowledge reflected the Enlightenment commitment to organizing information according to empirical criteria rather than traditional authorities. The archaeological investigations that began during the 18th century provided unprecedented opportunities for the systematic study of Roman religious practices and their relationship to mythological narratives. The excavations at Herculaneum, which began in 1738, revealed remarkably preserved examples of Roman religious art and architecture that enabled scholars to understand how mythological themes had been integrated into daily life. The discovery of household shrines containing representations of Roman gods demonstrated the practical religious functions that mythological figures had served, while the elaborate frescoes found in private residences showed how mythological narratives had been employed for decorative and educational purposes. These archaeological findings provided concrete evidence for the social and cultural context that had shaped Roman mythological traditions. The systematic excavation of Pompeii, which began in 1748, revealed an entire Roman city frozen at the moment of its destruction, providing scholars with comprehensive evidence for understanding Roman religious practices and their relationship to mythological beliefs. The discovery of temples dedicated to various Roman gods enabled archaeologists to reconstruct the spatial organization of Roman religious life, while the preservation of religious artifacts and inscriptions provided detailed information about specific cultic practices. The Temple of Isis at Pompeii, with its elaborate decorative program and well-preserved ritual equipment, demonstrated how mystery religions had been integrated into Roman urban life, while the numerous household shrines found throughout the city reveal the extent to which mythological figures had been incorporated into domestic religious practices. The development of systematic approaches to artifact analysis during this period enabled scholars to extract detailed information about Roman religious practices from material remains. Johann Joachim Winckelmann's History of Ancient Art established methodological principles for understanding the relationship between artistic representations and religious beliefs, arguing that careful analysis of stylistic development could reveal the historical evolution of mythological concepts. Winckelmann's analysis of Roman sculptures and paintings demonstrated how artistic representations of gods and heroes had changed over time, reflecting broader cultural transformations in Roman society. His systematic approach to artistic analysis provided models for understanding how mythological themes had been adapted to serve different social and political functions throughout Roman history. The emergence of comparative methodology during the Enlightenment enabled scholars to analyze Roman mythology within broader frameworks of human religious development. The French scholar Charles de Brosses's On the Worship of Fetish Gods established theoretical frameworks for understanding the relationship between different religious traditions, arguing that all mythological systems represented stages in humanity's intellectual development from primitive superstition to rational understanding. His analysis of Roman mythology focused on identifying parallels with other ancient religious traditions, demonstrating how similar natural phenomena had inspired comparable mythological narratives across different cultures. This comparative approach enabled scholars to understand Roman mythology as part of universal patterns of human religious development, rather than as a unique cultural achievement. The application of comparative methodology to mythological study required the development of new analytical tools that could identify underlying similarities while respecting cultural specificity. The German scholar Friedrich Max Müller's work on Indo-European mythology demonstrated how linguistic analysis could reveal common origins for mythological traditions that appeared superficially different. His analysis of Roman divine names showed how many Latin religious terms derived from Proto-Indo-European roots that had also influenced Greek, Germanic, and Sanskrit mythological vocabularies. This linguistic evidence provided empirical support for theories about the historical relationships between different mythological traditions, while revealing the specific cultural adaptations that had shaped Roman religious concepts. The philosophical critique of religious authority that characterized the Enlightenment led to systematic questioning of mythological narratives' claims to truth and moral authority. Voltaire's philosophical dictionary subjected Roman mythology to withering rational analysis, arguing that mythological narratives represented primitive attempts to understand natural phenomena that had been rendered obsolete by scientific advancement. His analysis of Jupiter's mythological attributes demonstrated how rational explanation could account for supernatural phenomena, while his treatment of Roman religious practices emphasized their social and political functions rather than their spiritual significance. Voltaire's approach to mythological criticism established models for understanding religious traditions as historical phenomena rather than sources of authoritative knowledge. The development of historical criticism during this period enabled scholars to analyze mythological sources with unprecedented analytical sophistication. The German scholar Johann Salomo Semler's work on biblical criticism established methodological principles that were subsequently applied to classical mythological texts, demonstrating how careful analysis of linguistic evidence and historical context could reveal the processes by which mythological narratives had been created and transmitted. His analysis of Roman mythological sources showed how different historical periods had contributed distinct layers of interpretation to traditional narratives, while his identification of textual inconsistencies revealed the composite nature of many mythological traditions. The emergence of antiquarian studies as a systematic discipline provided new frameworks for understanding the relationship between mythological narratives and historical evidence. The Society of Antiquaries of London, founded in 1707, established methodological principles for the systematic study of ancient artifacts and their relationship to historical knowledge. the Society's investigations of Roman Britain revealed extensive evidence for the practice of Roman religious traditions in provincial contexts, while their analysis of inscriptions and archaeological remains provided detailed information about how mythological themes had been adapted to local cultural conditions. These antiquarian investigations demonstrated the practical importance of mythological knowledge for understanding historical development while maintaining critical distance from mythological claims to supernatural authority. The development of numismatic studies during the 18th century provided valuable evidence for understanding how Roman mythological themes had been employed for political and religious purposes. The systematic cataloguing of Roman coins revealed the extent to which imperial authorities had used mythological imagery to communicate political messages, while the analysis of regional variations in coin design demonstrated how mythological themes had been adapted to appeal to different populations throughout the empire. The French scholar Joseph Hilarius Eckel's Doctrina Numorum Veterum established comprehensive methodologies for analysing ancient coins as historical sources, demonstrating how numismatic evidence could illuminate the practical functions of mythological narratives in Roman society. The systematic study of Roman inscriptions that developed during this period provided additional evidence for understanding the relationship between mythological beliefs and social practices. The compilation of inscriptional evidence from throughout the former Roman Empire revealed the extent to which mythological themes had been integrated into legal, commercial, and personal contexts, while the analysis of dedicatory inscriptions provided detailed information about specific religious practices and their social significance. The discovery of curse tablets and other forms of popular religious expression demonstrated how mythological figures had been employed in contexts that differed significantly from their representation in literary sources, revealing the complex relationship between elite and popular religious traditions. The neoclassical artistic movement that emerged during the 18th century created new opportunities for the visual representation of Roman mythological themes while reflecting contemporary rational approaches to classical learning. The French painter Jacques-Louis David's mythological works demonstrated how classical themes could be employed to communicate contemporary political and moral messages, while his emphasis on historical accuracy reflected the period's commitment to empirical investigation of ancient sources. David's Oath of the Horatii employed Roman historical narrative to explore themes of civic duty and personal sacrifice, while his careful attention to archaeological evidence for ancient clothing, architecture, and military equipment demonstrated how artistic representation could serve educational functions. The development of neoclassical sculpture during this period similarly reflected the influence of rational approaches to classical learning, as artists sought to create works that demonstrated their mastery of ancient artistic principles while appealing to contemporary aesthetic sensibilities. The Italian sculptor Antonio Canova's mythological works combined sophisticated understanding of classical sculptural techniques with rational analysis of mythological narratives, creating representations that emphasized the moral and philosophical dimensions of classical themes rather than their supernatural elements. Canova's Perseus with the head of Medusa demonstrated how mythological subjects could be employed to explore universal human themes while maintaining scholarly accuracy in the treatment of classical sources. The influence of Enlightenment rationalism on artistic representation of mythological themes extended beyond individual works to encompass comprehensive programs of cultural education and political communication. The decorative programs developed for public buildings during this period employed mythological themes to communicate rational principles of government and social organization. while the establishment of public museums created new venues for the display and interpretation of ancient artifacts. The British Museum, founded in 1753, established methodological principles for the systematic collection and display of ancient materials that would influence museum practice throughout Europe, while its educational programs demonstrated how mythological knowledge could be employed to promote rational understanding of historical development. The emergence of professional archaeology during the late 18th century provided new methodologies for understanding the relationship between mythological narratives and historical evidence. The systematic excavation techniques developed by scholars like Sir William Hamilton enabled more precise analysis of archaeological contexts, while the careful documentation of artifact associations provided evidence for understanding how mythological themes had been integrated into ancient social practices. Hamilton's investigations of ancient pottery and other artifacts from southern Italy revealed extensive evidence for the practical religious functions of mythological imagery, while his systematic approach to archaeological documentation established models for subsequent archaeological investigation. The development of scientific approaches to artifact analysis during this period enabled scholars to extract unprecedented amounts of information from archaeological remains. The application of chemical analysis to ancient pigments and materials provided evidence for understanding ancient artistic techniques and their relationship to mythological representation, while the systematic study of ancient manufacturing processes revealed the economic and social context that had shaped mythological imagery. These scientific approaches to archaeological investigation demonstrated how empirical methodologies could illuminate aspects of ancient religious life that had been inaccessible to earlier scholars, while maintaining the critical distance that characterized Enlightenment approaches to traditional authority. The systematic cataloguing of archaeological collections that developed during this period created comprehensive resources for comparative analysis of mythological themes across different regions and time periods. The publication of detailed archaeological catalogues enabled scholars throughout Europe to compare findings from different sites, while the establishment of international scholarly networks facilitated the exchange of information about new discoveries and interpretive methodologies. These collaborative approaches to archaeological investigation demonstrated how Enlightenment principles of rational inquiry could be applied to the systematic study of ancient religious traditions, while the accumulation of empirical evidence provided increasingly sophisticated understanding of the historical development of Roman mythological traditions. The transformation of Roman mythological studies that began during the 19th century represented a fundamental shift from the antiquarian curiosity of the Enlightenment to rigorous academic disciplines employing scientific methodologies. German classical scholarship, emerging from the universities of Berlin, Göttingen, and Bonn, established the philological foundations that would dominate mythological research for the next century. Friedrich August Wolff's revolutionary approach to Homeric studies, outlined in his Prolegomena ad Homerum, provided methodological frameworks that scholars like Karl Ottfried Müller applied to Roman mythological sources. Müller's systematic analysis of Roman religious traditions in his Handbuch der Archäologie, der Kunst, demonstrated how careful linguistic analysis could reveal the historical layers underlying mythological narratives, distinguishing between indigenous Italic elements, Etruscan influences, and Greek adaptations. The development of comparative religion as an academic discipline during the mid-19th century fundamentally altered approaches to Roman mythology by placing it within broader frameworks of human religious development. Friedrich Max Müller's lectures on comparative mythology at Oxford University established theoretical foundations for understanding mythological traditions as products of linguistic confusion and natural observation. His analysis of Indo-European mythological systems revealed how Roman divine names preserved ancient linguistic roots that connected Latin religious vocabulary to Sanskrit, Greek, and Germanic traditions. Müller's solar mythology theory, which interpreted most mythological narratives as allegorical descriptions of solar phenomena, provided systematic explanations for the apparent similarities between different mythological traditions while maintaining scholarly focus on empirical evidence rather than speculative interpretation. The archaeological revolution that transformed 19th century classical studies provided unprecedented material evidence for understanding Roman religious practices and their relationship to mythological narratives. Heinrich Schliemann's excavations at Troy, beginning in 1871, demonstrated how systematic archaeological investigation could illuminate the historical contexts underlying mythological traditions. The discovery of Bronze Age settlements at the site traditionally associated with the Trojan War provided concrete evidence for the historical foundations of mythological narratives, while the systematic documentation of architectural remains and artifact assemblages reveal the material culture that had shaped ancient religious practices. Schliemann's methodological innovations, including the use of photography for archaeological documentation and the systematic recording of stratigraphic contexts, established standards for archaeological investigation that would influence subsequent research on Roman religious sites. The excavation of Roman religious sites throughout the Mediterranean during the late 19th century provided comprehensive evidence for understanding how mythological themes had been integrated into ancient religious practices. The systematic investigation of the sanctuary of Diana at Nemi, conducted by Sir James George Fraser and other scholars, revealed the complex ritual practices that had surrounded the worship of Roman deities in their original contexts. The discovery of votive offerings, ritual deposits, and architectural remains provided detailed information about the practical religious functions of mythological figures, while the analysis of inscriptional evidence revealed the social and economic context that had shaped ancient religious practices. These archaeological investigations demonstrated how mythological narratives had been embedded within comprehensive religious systems that addressed practical concerns about fertility, protection, and social order. The emergence of psychological interpretations of mythology during the early 20th century introduced entirely new frameworks for understanding the significance of Roman mythological traditions. Sigmund Freud's analysis of mythological narratives as expressions of unconscious psychological processes, outlined in works like Totem and Taboo, provided systematic explanations for the universal appeal of certain mythological themes. Freud's interpretation of the Oedipus complex as a fundamental psychological structure underlying human development enabled scholars to understand Roman mythological narratives about family relationships and generational conflict as expressions of universal psychological tensions. His analysis of Jupiter's overthrow of Saturn, Venus's relationships with multiple divine and mortal lovers, and Mars's role in both warfare and fertility provided psychological explanations for mythological themes that had previously been understood primarily through historical or literary analysis. Carl Gustav Jung's development of analytical psychology during the 1920s and 1930s provided even more sophisticated frameworks for understanding the psychological significance of mythological traditions. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, populated by universal archetypes that appeared in mythological narratives across different cultures, offered explanations for the enduring appeal of Roman mythological themes. His analysis of archetypal figures like the Great Mother, represented in Roman mythology by Cybele and Ceres, the wise old man, embodied by figures like Saturn and Janus, and the hero, exemplified by Aeneas and Hercules, demonstrated how Roman mythological narratives expressed fundamental psychological patterns that transcended specific cultural contexts. Jung's approach to mythological interpretation enabled scholars to understand Roman mythology as a repository of psychological wisdom that remained relevant to contemporary human experience. The influence of Jungian analysis on 20th century mythological scholarship extended far beyond academic psychology to encompass literary criticism, anthropological research, and popular culture interpretation. Joseph Campbell's comparative analysis of mythological traditions, culminating in The Hero with 1,000 Faces, demonstrated how Roman mythological narratives followed universal patterns of heroic development that appeared in cultures throughout the world. Campbell's identification of the monomyth, a basic narrative structure underlying heroic stories across different cultures, provided frameworks for understanding how Roman mythological themes had been adapted and transformed in subsequent literary and cultural traditions. His analysis of Aeneas's journey from Troy to Italy as an example of the universal hero's journey demonstrated how Roman mythological narratives continue to provide meaningful models for understanding personal and cultural transformation. The development of structuralist approaches to mythology during the mid-20th century provided new methodologies for analysing the internal logic and symbolic systems underlying Roman mythological narratives. Claude Lévi-Strauss's analysis of mythological structures, outlined in works like The Raw and the Cooked, demonstrated how mythological narratives functioned as systematic attempts to resolve fundamental contradictions in human experience. His analysis of Roman mythological themes related to nature and culture, life and death, and order and chaos revealed how these narratives provided symbolic frameworks for understanding and managing the tensions inherent in human social life. Lévi-Strauss's structural analysis of Roman mythology demonstrated how these ancient narratives continue to function as sophisticated intellectual systems that addressed fundamental questions about human existence and social organization. The influence of Roman mythological themes in modern literature began with the Romantic movement's rediscovery of classical sources as repositories of emotional and spiritual truth. Lord Byron's use of Roman mythological imagery in works like Childe Harold's Pilgrimage demonstrated how classical themes could be employed to explore contemporary concerns about individual freedom, political revolution, and cultural transformation. His treatment of Roman historical figures like Caesar and Pompey as mythological archetypes representing different approaches to power and authority provided models for understanding how ancient narratives could illuminate modern political and social conflicts. Byron's integration of Roman mythological themes with romantic emphasis on individual experience and emotional authenticity established patterns that would influence subsequent literary treatment of classical materials. Percy Bysshe Shelley's Prometheus. Unbound exemplified the romantic transformation of classical mythological themes, adapting the story of Prometheus's defiance of divine authority to explore contemporary concerns about political revolution and human liberation. Shelley's treatment of Jupiter as a symbol of oppressive political authority and Prometheus as a figure of revolutionary resistance demonstrated how Roman mythological narratives could be reinterpreted to address modern political and social concerns. His emphasis on the transformative power of love and imagination, embodied in the figure of Asia, provided psychological and spiritual dimensions that connected classical mythological themes to romantic philosophical principles. Shelley's work established precedents for employing Roman mythological narratives as vehicles for exploring contemporary political and social issues. The development of historical fiction during the 19th century created new venues for the popular dissemination of Roman mythological themes. Edward Bulwer Lytton's The Last Days of Pompeii combined archaeological knowledge with dramatic narrative to create vivid representations of Roman religious practices and their relationship to mythological beliefs. The novel's detailed descriptions of the Temple of Isis, the gladiatorial games, and the various religious festivals provided readers with comprehensive understanding of how mythological themes had been integrated into Roman daily life. Bulwer Lytton's careful attention to historical accuracy, based on contemporary archaeological discoveries, demonstrated how literary representation could serve educational functions while maintaining dramatic appeal. The novel's enormous popularity established markets for historical fiction that would continue to disseminate Roman mythological themes to popular audiences throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The emergence of cinema during the early 20th century provided unprecedented opportunities for the visual representation of Roman mythological themes. Giovanni Pastrone's Cabiria, one of the first epic films, employed Roman mythological imagery to create spectacular visual narratives that brought ancient religious practices to life for contemporary audiences. The film's elaborate sets, depicting temples dedicated to Moloch and other ancient deities, demonstrated how cinematic technology could recreate the visual splendor of ancient religious ceremonies while maintaining scholarly accuracy in the treatment of mythological themes. The success of Cabiria established cinema as a major venue for the popular dissemination of Roman mythological narratives, while its influence on subsequent filmmakers like D.W. Griffith and Cecil B. DeMille ensured that Roman mythological themes would remain prominent in popular entertainment throughout the 20th century. The Hollywood epic films of the 1950s and 1960s represented the culmination of cinematic treatment of Roman mythological themes, combining spectacular visual effects with dramatic narratives that emphasized the moral and spiritual dimensions of classical stories. William Wyler's Ben-Hur employed Roman religious and mythological imagery to create a comprehensive vision of ancient Mediterranean civilization, while its treatment of the relationship between Roman imperial authority and emerging Christianity demonstrated how mythological themes could be employed to explore contemporary religious and political concerns. The film's elaborate chariot race sequence, set within the context of Roman religious festivals, provided audiences with visceral understanding of how mythological themes had been integrated into ancient entertainment and social practices. The development of fantasy literature during the 20th century created new opportunities for the creative adaptation of Roman mythological themes. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings trilogy, while primarily drawing upon Germanic and Celtic mythological traditions, incorporated Roman mythological elements that demonstrated the continued relevance of classical themes for contemporary fantasy narratives. Tolkien's treatment of themes like the corruption of power, the relationship between civilization and nature, and the role of fate in human affairs reflected his deep knowledge of classical literature and mythology. His creation of a comprehensive mythological system that could address contemporary concerns about industrialization, warfare, and environmental destruction provided models for subsequent fantasy authors who sought to employ mythological themes for serious literary purposes. The emergence of contemporary archaeological techniques during the late 20th century revolutionized understanding of Roman religious practices and their relationship to mythological narratives. The development of scientific dating methods, including radiocarbon dating and thermoluminescence analysis, enabled archaeologists to establish precise chronologies for the development of Roman religious sites and practices. The systematic application of these techniques to Roman religious sites throughout the Mediterranean revealed the complex historical processes that had shaped the development of Roman mythological traditions. while the analysis of environmental evidence provided detailed information about the ecological contexts that had influenced ancient religious practices. The discovery of the Antikythera mechanism in 1976, a complex astronomical calculator from ancient Greece, revolutionized understanding of ancient scientific knowledge and its relationship to mythological traditions. The device's sophisticated mechanical design demonstrated that ancient Mediterranean civilizations possessed far more advanced scientific knowledge than previously recognized, while its use for predicting astronomical events revealed how scientific observation had been integrated with religious and mythological frameworks. The analysis of the mechanism's inscriptions, which included references to various mythological festivals and religious observances, provided evidence for understanding how Roman mythological traditions had been connected to sophisticated astronomical knowledge and scientific observation. The development of digital humanities during the early 21st century created new opportunities for the systematic analysis of Roman mythological traditions. The creation of comprehensive databases containing all known references to Roman mythological themes in ancient literature enabled scholars to conduct systematic analyses of how specific mythological narratives had been employed by different authors and in different historical contexts. The digital atlas of Roman and medieval civilizations, developed by Harvard University, provided comprehensive mapping of Roman religious sites and their relationship to mythological traditions, while the Perseus Digital Library made primary sources accessible to scholars and students throughout the world. These digital resources enabled unprecedented systematic analysis of Roman mythological traditions while making scholarly research accessible to broader audiences. Contemporary archaeological discoveries continue to transform understanding of Roman religious practices and their relationship to mythological narratives. The excavation of the Mithraeum beneath the Church of San Clemente in Rome, completed in 1967, revealed remarkably preserved examples of mystery religion practices and their integration with Roman mythological traditions. The discovery of elaborate frescoes depicting the Mithraic mysteries, along with ritual equipment and inscriptional evidence, provided detailed information about how Roman mythological themes had been adapted for mystery religion practices. The systematic analysis of these materials using contemporary archaeological techniques revealed the complex syncretistic processes that had shaped Roman religious development throughout the imperial period. The ongoing excavation of Pompeii and Herculaneum continues to provide new evidence for understanding Roman religious practices and their relationship to mythological traditions. The discovery of the Villa of the Papyri at Herculaneum, with its extensive library of philosophical and literary texts, revealed how Roman intellectual elites had understood and interpreted mythological traditions within broader frameworks of philosophical and scientific knowledge. The systematic analysis of these texts using contemporary philological techniques has revealed previously unknown works by ancient authors, while the application of advanced imaging technologies has enabled scholars to read texts that had been carbonized by the volcanic eruption. These discoveries continue to transform understanding of how Roman mythological traditions had been integrated into ancient intellectual and cultural life. Contemporary scholarly debates regarding the relationship between Roman mythology and social structures focus particularly on issues of gender, class, and imperial ideology. Feminist scholars like Mary Beard have demonstrated how Roman mythological narratives both reflected and reinforced patriarchal social structures, while revealing the complex ways in which women had participated in Roman religious life, despite legal and social restrictions. The analysis of goddess figures like Vesta, Diana, and Minerva has revealed how Roman mythological traditions had provided frameworks for understanding female power and authority, while the study of mystery religions has demonstrated how some religious traditions had offered women opportunities for spiritual authority that were unavailable in other social contexts. The investigation of Roman mythology's relationship to imperial ideology has revealed how mythological narratives were systematically employed to legitimize Roman political authority and territorial expansion. Scholars like Clifford Andoh have demonstrated how Roman mythological traditions were adapted to support imperial claims to universal authority, while the analysis of provincial religious practices has revealed how Roman mythological themes were modified to appeal to diverse populations throughout the empire. The study of imperial cult practices has shown how Roman mythological frameworks were employed to create religious foundations for political authority, while the investigation of resistance movements has revealed how alternative mythological traditions were employed to challenge Roman imperial claims. The relationship between Roman mythology and contemporary popular culture continues to evolve as new media technologies create opportunities for creative adaptation and reinterpretation. The success of films like Gladiator and television series like Rome demonstrates the continued popular appeal of Roman mythological themes, while their treatment of issues like political corruption, social inequality, and cultural conflict reveals how ancient narratives continue to provide frameworks for understanding contemporary concerns. The development of video games based on Roman mythological themes has created interactive experiences that allow players to explore ancient religious practices and mythological narratives in unprecedented ways, while the emergence of social media has enabled new forms of scholarly communication and public engagement with Roman mythological traditions. The integration of Roman mythological themes into contemporary educational curricula reflects ongoing efforts to maintain connections between classical learning and modern intellectual development. The development of interdisciplinary approaches that combine historical, literary, archaeological, and psychological perspectives has created comprehensive frameworks for understanding Roman mythological traditions and their continued relevance to contemporary human experience. The creation of online resources and digital learning platforms has made Roman mythological knowledge accessible to global audiences, while the development of virtual reality technologies promises to create immersive experiences that will enable future students to explore ancient religious sites and practices in unprecedented ways. The enduring influence of Roman mythology on contemporary culture reflects its fundamental engagement with universal human concerns about power, love, death, and meaning that transcend specific historical contexts. The psychological insights embedded within Roman mythological narratives continue to provide valuable frameworks for understanding human behavior and social relationships, while the artistic and literary traditions that have developed from Roman mythological themes continue to inspire creative expression across multiple media. The scholarly methodologies that have been developed for analysing Roman mythological traditions have contributed to broader understanding of how human societies create and maintain meaningful cultural systems, while the ongoing archaeological investigation of Roman religious sites continues to reveal new evidence for understanding the complex relationships between belief, practice, and social organisation. As we advance further into the 21st century, Roman mythology remains a vital component of global cultural heritage, continuing to inform artistic expression, scholarly research, and popular entertainment while providing enduring frameworks for understanding fundamental aspects of human experience. The digital preservation of Roman mythological texts and artifacts ensures that these materials will remain accessible to future generations, while the development of new analytical techniques promises to reveal previously unknown aspects of Roman religious life and its relationship to broader patterns of human cultural development. The transformation of Roman mythology from ancient religious practice to contemporary cultural resource demonstrates the remarkable capacity of human creative expression to transcend temporal and cultural boundaries, ensuring that the wisdom embedded within these ancient narratives will continue to enrich human understanding for generations to come